So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are, as I'm sure you know at this point, in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's last complete book on revolution. This is a book very much that takes her lifelong thinking about freedom and action and politics and brings it together and does it within the context of comparing the American and French revolutions, all with an eye towards understanding what revolution is. Yes, but revolution is here a word that means something else. It's what it means to pursue a life of freedom and a free government in the modern age, and so the argument really is that in some sense, something about revolution is connected to the possibility of free citizen life. We read it in the preface to the book about the importance of how only freedom could justify war and revolution today. And we're now getting into that part of the book, especially in the next chapters, but even already in this chapter on the pursuit of happiness, where we begin to see and talk about what Arendt is calling the revolutionary spirit. And this spirit, which she thinks pervaded both the French and the American revolutions, has become endangered and may even be lost. And this is the arc of the book. The last chapter is called the revolutionary tradition and the lost treasure of the revolutionary tradition. And so this idea of the revolutionary spirit, which really enters the book here in this chapter on the pursuit of happiness, becomes is something we need to focus on and make sure we attend to. And so if the argument of this chapter is simple, I think in many ways it's often the forgotten chapter of the book. People are really angry or engaged with the social question because of what she says about poverty and appearance and slavery to a certain extent. The two chapters on constitutionalism are widely read, probably the two center chapters of the book. And then the final chapter is certainly well known for her argument that this tradition has been lost, and some of her comments on ideas to resurrect it have been very popular. And movements like Occupy Wall Street and other anarchic movements have picked up on a lot of what she says in that final chapter. And obviously we'll talk about that more when we get there. But from now on, this idea of the spirit of the revolution is going to predominate. And the argument of this chapter is somewhat deceptively simple. It's that in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson changed a word, right? The normal formulation that we have is life, liberty, and property coming out of Locke. And that Jefferson changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Arendt does a number of things in the book. First, in this chapter, she says that this change is not simply innocent. It actually reflects a view that was held at the time, and she traces this idea of public happiness as it was talked about and discussed by Jefferson and Madison and others in different documents and at the time. And then she says, okay, and that this idea of public happiness is very much tied up with the idea of public freedom, of being free together in public, and that what Jefferson did, intentionally or unintentionally, by writing pursuit of happiness instead of pursuit of property, was to bring in this idea of public happiness and thus public freedom into the American political tradition, first in the Declaration of Independence and by extension into the wider American political tradition. She traces this love of public freedom and public happiness back to the hommes de lettres, the men of letters on the continent, and argues that these were intellectuals and these were noble men, and they were fairly well off, and they had great privileges, and they could have lived a very happy life. And they chose, she says, these men of letters, which she distinguishes from public intellectuals, to give up their privileges, lose their consideration, and live a private life in which they wrote and thought about what she calls a new idea of freedom, this idea of public freedom. And this is an idea that she's going to write a lot about in many of her books. In her essay, What is Freedom? It's the main point of the essay, that traditionally freedom is understood as freedom of the will. Therefore, it's my individual freedom to will and do something, and it's internal. And what she says is that what these revolutionists discovered and what the men of letters discovered was a new idea of freedom, not as a product of the will or of the person, but as a political act, as a political public way of being in the world. And that this is what the men of letters discovered, and that's what Jefferson brings into the Declaration of Independence through the formulation of happiness, pursuit of happiness. But that even from the beginning, the formulation of happiness, pursuit of happiness, was ambiguous. On the one hand, it was this public happiness. On the other hand, it was a kind of private happiness, the happiness of pursuing property and well-being. And this ambiguity, on the one hand, motivated the founders in their pursuit of public happiness, and it was what in great part led to the possibility of the American constitutional tradition. On the other hand, and sadly, this ambiguity led over time to the forgetting of the original weight given to public happiness and to the corrupting of it in the direction of private happiness. And so she'll say in the last few pages of the text that freedom and luxury are incompatible, and that to a certain extent, as the American dream came to be understood as the dream of milk and honey, as it became to be understood as the land where you could come and pursue your riches and attain luxury, which it had always been to some extent, but she thinks the men of letters receded from that, and the founding fathers and their generation receded from that. And really, and this is the sort of, I think, great insight of this chapter, and it's an insight that, again, I'm happy to have people tell me, I don't know of anyone else who really focused on this before her. It's this idea that politics is fun. A few years later, after this book is published, you have the civil rights movement and the Vietnam protests of the 60s. And Arendt, was taken again by the fact that young people were having fun in politics. And I think during the Occupy movement as a teacher, I had a lot of questions about Occupy on many levels. But one thing that was extraordinary to me was to see my students and many young people and some older people having fun in politics, feeling alive by being engaged in the public world. And that is something that is really what the pursuit of happiness is about, the pursuit of public happiness. Unfortunately, as you'll see in the chapter, Arendt says freedom and luxury are incompatible, and over time, as America became known as the promised land where milk and honey flow, it was to a certain degree inevitable that we would increasingly interpret happiness economically and through property, and lose the sense of happiness as an idea of public freedom. And this would uh, allow for the dimming and even loss of what she calls here the revolutionary spirit. And so this becomes one of the questions that then are going to inform and really, I think, drive the next 3 chapters, which is, to what extent can you create a republic in which the pursuit of public freedom and public happiness can last? One of the real questions of the next 2 chapters, Constitutio Libertatis 1 and 2, is that the Americans, she says, didn't want to just create a free government for the people then. They wanted it to last and endure as a free government, and that was the problem they were obsessed with. And she talks about the ways in which they tried to solve that problem, the ways in which the problem was solved to some degree. But the underlying danger that doesn't get solved is this: the dominance of luxury over freedom. And this becomes sort of the tragic flaw that in the last chapter will return. So that's a quick summary of this chapter, of why it's important in the book. I hope you had a chance to watch the introductory video where I went into it much more in depth. Why don't we see if you guys have some questions? I see not a lot written so far. You're characteristically silent this week, uncharacteristically silent, at least in your writing. Does any questions, verbal questions or written questions, people have? Did they like this? Did you guys find this chapter too easy? I mean, in many ways, it's the easiest chapter in the book, and I say that in a lot of ways. One is, it's the only chapter that doesn't have subsections. It's sort of like just straight through. There's no subsections in it, which just shows you that she's really got one idea that she's pushing through here in this chapter. Although there is this progression from the worry about necessity, the rise of public liberty, how Jefferson incorporates it in the Declaration of Independence, and how it becomes ambiguous and how it is lost. So it's a story in that arc as we go. So Gary, you're right. It is a great idea. Gary says it's one idea, but it's a great idea. And it is a great idea. I mean, I think that I take this seriously. I mean, during the Occupy movement, one of the things that just kept coming back to me was my students were coming back exhilarated, and they were having fun, and they would say things to me like, people are listening to me, and we're making a difference, and and as some of you know, one of my critiques of Occupy was, well, leave the park and occupy the town councils, if you want to make a difference. But even though I had that in the back of my head some of the time, it was clear that these folks were experiencing what Arendt here called public happiness. And one of the things she says in this chapter is that the people in France, they had a taste of it. They could sense it, but they didn't experience it. It was only in America, and the reason again is the practice in America of town councils and town governments, and the fact that there wasn't a large bureaucracy or administrative state, so that the people in the country, she said, went to these meetings and went to legislatures and went to city councils and went to town councils and county councils not out of obligation and not out of interest, but because it was fun. Now, we can all be a little skeptical of this, right? I mean, we should be skeptical. I'm sure they went out of interest, and I'm sure they somewhat went out of duty. But I think she has picked up on something that, again, very few people had written about before. And in all honesty, it's still an underemphasized part of political theory, because people who write about political theory, they have their noses in their books and they're all writing theory. But what people forget is it's fun. And that idea of fun has come into protest. And this was sort of the Occupy issue. But the question is, can you make governing fun? Can you make being part of ruling fun? And, she quotes this wonderful letter that Thomas Jefferson writes to John Adams, where, Adams says, may we meet again, basically in heaven, right? In Congress. And she makes a lot of this. It's on page 122. And Jefferson writes, may we meet there again in Congress with our ancient colleagues and receive with them the seal of approbation. Well done, good and faithful servants. I mean, and what Arendt does is say, take this seriously. Jefferson saw Congress as like heaven. And that was really something that had a huge impression on her here. And the reason is that because in Congress you would get the applause, the demonstration of acclaim, the esteem of the world, which Jefferson, she writes, says in another context, was of higher value in my eye than everything in the world. And that's this idea of public happiness that she's talking about. And so one of the questions will be in the next two chapters on the constitution of the country. How do you constitute a country and create constitutional republican institutions that allow for that happiness to persist, allow for that spirit of revolution, of public freedom to persist? So Gary, I'm going to take some questions. Hopefully we'll have some. Gary says, as participants may remember, I was a politician and an elected official for 20 years. And I entered into this life because of the experience of fun I had in my initial encounter with the public happiness in Santa Cruz, California. That's great. And Gary, was the experience of being an elected official fun? Can I ask you that?
Yes, absolutely, Roger. It was. And I had read On Revolution in college. I went to Stanford and was in an honors program on social thought and institutions. We read that book. We focused on utopia. And when I came to Santa Cruz and got involved just by very great chance with an effort to save a particularly wonderful place in Santa Cruz called Lighthouse Field, I suddenly realized, well, this was what Hannah Arendt had talked about, because it was just an upwelling of citizens who got engaged on something they cared about and changed public policy. And I ended up being the leading figure in that, and then got elected. And then for the 20 years I was on the board of supervisors here, we fundamentally changed the laws relating to growth and development to protect ourselves from Silicon Valley. And incredible fun. I had a meeting every Monday before Tuesday's board meeting at a coffee house. People came, we talked about it, etc. It was incredibly fun. And so what you say here is, it seems to be indeed a lost treasure, and I hope indivisible in the other efforts now. I mean, it may be this is like the vaccination that'll start our immune system working again. But it is, she has profoundly I mean, I don't know that she had that kind of experience herself, but she was wise enough to understand exactly what it meant, and terrifically insightful.
Yeah, one thing to say is that she did have some experiences with at least some kind of protest. In that she, as some of you know, worked with some Zionist organizations in Germany. She was arrested. She escaped to France, and then in France, she worked with the Youth Aliyah movement and brought one boatload of children to Palestine. So she had some of that experience, but not in the idea of governing. Um, she did go to some Zionist congresses, and in the 1950s, she was appointed one of the two people to represent world Jewry uh, in trying to figure out what to do with all the Jewish property that had been, in a sense, piled up to be put in museums by the Nazis. So she,
Yep. I'm sorry. I think she did. I misspoke because the resistance in France, she definitely understood that in the same context.
yeah, I mean, if you read what she writes about René Char, and you read some of René Char's writing, who is a poet who at first began to resent the war and the resistance because it took him away from poetry. But then as the resistance went on, he came to understand the beauty of resistance. And it's not that when the war was over, he wanted the war to continue, but he writes about what he's lost when the war ends, because the experience of that life of resistance and what he calls public happiness. And Arendt actually takes a lot of this language from René Char and from people she's writing about the resistance in France. And if you read the introduction to Between Past and Future, which we have read, it starts with René Char, and he comes up in a number of places also in this book. I should just point, for those of you who are going to be here next week, one of the speakers we have coming to the conference is Micah White. And Micah White was one of the original people who started Occupy. He designed the poster with the bull and the ballerina on it that some of you probably remember. And yet, after the protests ended, he became very disillusioned with it. I think for good reasons. And he wrote a book called The End of Protest. And he then has become an advocate for doing exactly what Gary has done, which is go and run for local office, and saying that the way to make a difference and to bring about the revolution is not through protest, but through local politics and getting involved on local levels. And he's going to be speaking at the conference along with Zephyr Teachout. I think it's going to be an excellent conversation. So I think this is something that Arendt really gets and can bring to bear. I mean, one of the side projects, or not side projects, but one of the papers that I've been working on and publishing things out of in the last 5 years is an argument with a number of contemporary political thinkers, Jacques Rancière, David Graeber, Simon Critchley, to name three, all of whom I have great respect for, but who are making an argument, as I understand it, that freedom is no longer possible in a modern political state, and that the only way to experience freedom is by setting oneself against the state in a situation of protest. And that anarchists, and so it's a kind of new kind of anarchism that they're representing, and that the way to be free is to live a life of constant protest against the state. And a lot of them have appealed to Hannah Arendt, right, as someone who has this radical idea of freedom and believes that revolution is an important part of freedom. But they've also been critical of her because, in the end, she wants to found states and found polities. And she thinks that in order to be a full human being, there has to be a public sphere in which you can appear in. And I've sort of set myself against this movement and said, you can still find freedom in politics. You just have to enter it. You have to engage in it. You have to insert yourself into the public sphere in a way that you're visible and can make it fun. And this seems to me a really meaningful debate right now, because so much of the left now is evacuating politics because they want to imagine themselves as part of protest. And so, Gary mentioned the resist and movement and others. I think they're great. But I think, again, there's a split within them between those who think we should be protesting and those who think we should be entering into a kind of attempt to govern. And the problem with governing, Austin, as Weber taught us, is that, when you govern, you have to, it's boring of hard boards. You can't be morally pure. You have to compromise. You have to talk to people you disagree with. You have to work across the aisle with people you disagree with. And a lot of people don't want to do that right now. And so this, to me, is a big issue of our time. But I think there is an opportunity to re-energize people to get back into government. One of the problems is that local government increasingly has less power. And they have less power for a number of reasons, but the main one is that they don't want to tax themselves. And if you don't tax yourself, you want your taxes to come from up high, counties or states or the federal government. Well, we all know power is where the money is, right? So if you don't tax yourself and you want to build a sewer, you've got to follow their rules on how you build a sewer. If you don't tax yourself and you want to have a school, you've got to follow their rules on what you teach and how you build a building. And so, one of the real issues that we have in this country is that we still believe ourselves to have local government, and Gary did it in San Jose. And I'd like to actually hear Gary talk about this to some degree if he's willing to, because if you give up the taxing power and you keep lowering local taxes and take the money from state and federal and county programs, you put yourself under their rules. Is that something you guys had to deal with in San Jose, Gary?
Not San Jose, but Santa Cruz, yes.
Santa Cruz. I'm sorry.
We did, well, if you lived in Santa Cruz, you would know that is a great insult. Thinking of San Jose is the same thing. However, you are absolutely correct, of course, the golden rule of government and politics. If you got the goal, you make the rules. And I do think that power has essentially migrated to the federal level. Looking at it from a legal point of view as a lawyer, essentially the idea of the federal system is still there in concept, but as a practicality, almost everything goes to the state and or federal level. And it's very, very difficult to forge your own community purpose and program and have the excitement of getting just sort of ordinary people engaged because they see they can do things. And we were, when I was elected in 1974, taking office in 75, before my initial entry was before in California Proposition 13, which was the taking away of the property tax essentially from local government. So we had actually, you would love the name of this, we had a group of just from the grassroots community activists concerned about social issues that called themselves the Community Congress. They adopted an alternative budget. They came to the Board of Supervisors the first year I was on the board, and by a 3-2 vote, very high tension kind of things, I being one of the three, we diverted millions of dollars into grassroots community programs as opposed to high-level county programs, and engendered a whole spirit in Santa Cruz that is quite different from San Jose or other places. So yes, you are right on target on that, of course.
Wonderful. That's what I really, that's what I think has to happen. And as we read the next two chapters on her idea of constitutionalism, which are to me, these are the two chapters of her work that probably are most speak to me. So when we get to this next two sessions, I hope you'll pay attention. She's going to be talking a lot about the importance of dispersing power from across multiple levels of government. And it's going to be the thing about the U.S. Constitution that she most finds most amazing, surprising, revolutionary, and important. And so these are issues we'll continue to talk about. Are there other people involved in government on on the group today? I know Gary is. I don't know if other people are that would like to have something they'd like to add along these lines, or I can go on. I just thought if there was. Yeah.
Roger, just before you ask for others to go on, let me just say one thing that about the issue you were just talking about from, again, my local government experience. During the time I was on the board, one of the federal projects affecting California and, in fact, affecting and infecting the entire nation was offshore oil development, obviously the oil companies being the single biggest power structure in the history of the world, probably. Santa Cruz people didn't want to have offshore oil rigs out in their bay and offshore. We'd experienced that down in Santa Barbara once with a massive oil spill. And so Santa Cruz started a group of local governments who paid in to me, actually, I was the treasurer in a way, money voluntarily. And we hired essentially a lobbyist and activist to organize our local coast to stop offshore oil drilling. And of course, it was a federal decision. We were successful in Congress. And so I always have talked about the ability of a truly engaged local government to leverage its own political power and then to affect the higher levels of government so that our way of governing on national issues, in fact, can effectively be from the local up. And we stopped the oil companies from drilling offshore California and, in fact, around the country on the coast for more than 20 years because of something that started literally with local activists in a small community.
Fascinating. Gonna write the next book about what you've done, Gary.
Roger, I'd like to add a slightly different perspective because although I'd never worked in government, a lot of the work that I did at an earlier time was not exactly protest. It was organizing to cancel or counter the powers that were controlling the bureaucracy. So it was to challenge the bureaucracy to act in a different way based on community input. And so we were able to get the unemployment office to pay closer attention to who they were paying money to and when. And we were able to get we were able to stop a rate increase on the telephone system and stuff like that, where we identified the problem as being the control of public institutions by moneyed interests. And in fact, we were ultimately defeated by the formation of an organization called the Mountain States Employers Organization, which was an attempt to, which was a successful attempt to depoliticize community involvement. So that's a different approach, but it's very similar. And it had, I think I can really truly understand Greg's experience because it had that impact within the local situation.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that local organizations, even if they're not governmental, fall within what Arendt would mean by political public activism and public happiness. I think she takes a lot of this to some degree from Tocqueville, and if you read his pages on both the town councils, but also his distinctions between civic organizations and political organizations, and he takes seriously the importance of both. There's no doubt that citizen engagement and protest and action and civil disobedience, which is another one of Arendt's key and most important ideas, is part of what creates a public world. Civil disobedience is not an individual conscientious act, she thinks, but it's aligning oneself with a group that is arguing for a particular idea of the public. And so that's why civil disobedience is so essential to the idea of public freedom. which is actually just a plug, the topic of our conference next year, civil disobedience and political freedom. So save your dates, October 11th and 12th, 2018. Anyway, let me move on. But I'm happy to have more of this come in, because to me, I love reading Arendt, but it's this kind of stuff, this kind of reflecting upon it and bringing it to bear that really, I think, is so important for us.
I swore I wouldn't get in this week.
There we go,
I wanted to build on Gary's point. He won. I lost a couple of times, so I can tell you it's tougher losing than winning, Gary. You can't wave your flag. But I do want to emphasize the fact that you have a local impact when you do anything in the public sphere. You do that door-to-door stuff, handing out the cards or whatever. Gary, I don't know how you did it out there, but here it's walking door to door. I did it in the same time frame, late 60s, 70s, and we're kind of over the hill, Gary. I got that part. But you can emphasize that the local politicians are the face of politics for people. They don't get to see the senators, they get to see you, and that's sort of the impact, that local impact of just being there, visible, you taking the time, just emphasizing that local part. And I did just one other thing you talked about later in the chapter, ambiguity. She mentions it's kind of a failing thing, the ambiguity that we have in our country. My point of view is that's the strength of our country, namely you do change. Times change, needs for laws change. Gary talked about the things that he did, changing the laws, that we don't have a fixed tradition, as she always talks about, a rigid system that there's no movement forward, or whichever way you want to go. Anyway, thanks for the time.
I think that's a really good point. I want to just pick up what Pat just said about the ambiguity. The ambiguity, I think, is exactly right. It's not bad. And in fact, what the danger is, the thing she worries about is that, in a sense, the public idea of public freedom has been lost, and the ambiguity has been, in a sense, lost. What Gary and Pat and Jack are talking about is it hasn't been completely lost. It's still there. The question is, can it come back in a meaningful way to meaningfully impact the country? And I don't have an answer to that. And she didn't have an answer to that. She didn't say it can't happen. In fact, she wrote the book, I think, very much in the hope that it would. But there's that is the question. And I guess her hope and my hope is that reading this book will spur people to be more open to this idea of what she calls the spirit of revolution. Susan writes, as much as we have worried about the loss of privacy, the real threat seems to be the loss of public life. When I was in school, we had citizenship clubs. Wow, I love that, Susan. Those no longer exist. It's a great point. I'm sure they must exist somewhere, and maybe someone is a member of one. But you're absolutely right. And what are citizenship clubs? I mean, Arendt talks about these debating societies that existed in Paris or in France, where people would get together and debate issues, not with the idea of coming to a solution per se, but just to debate them and be part of a public debate. I know that in California and San Francisco, there's something called the Commonwealth Society, where people bring in speakers, but it's more about bringing in speakers than it is debating. Is that what a citizenship club was, Susan? You get together and you debate an issue?
No, I'm talking about when I was in elementary school. And what it was is we were the safeties. We were responsible for making sure the littler kids got to school and were able to cross the streets. So it was a sense of participation in the school, of responsibility. And I've now done some research on the early black school in Charlottesville. And those students, they cut wood, they cleaned the buildings, they did everything for the school. And so it was their school. They felt ownership in the school. And I think that's what the idea of the Citizenship Club, at least where I grew up. But no, this was elementary school.
That's interesting. Well, I know from my own experience that I have more friends involved in local town councils now and local town movements and politics than ever in my life. I know that in the past, when I've tried to get involved, I found it incredibly off-putting, but I live in a New York City where it's a bit off-putting. But I think people are getting more involved in these kinds of things. So I agree with you. The problem, I think loss of privacy is a problem too. We obviously had a conference on that 2 years ago, and we spent a lot of time talking about it. Privacy matters also for public life. And the argument I've made is that, and I think it comes right out of Arendt in certain ways, is that in order to stand up and be seen and have the courage to stand up and represent a unique personal viewpoint in public life, you have to have a rich private life. You have to be able to develop your sense of who you are. And I think it's not an accident that the devolution of public life is concomitant with the devolution of private life. There's a degradation of courageous individualism, if you want to call it that, of people becoming who they are. Sherry Turkle, I think, in some wonderful writing on the use of texting by teenagers, writes about how the way teenagers text, they text so much. The numbers are astonishing, like 9 or 10 hours a day that they're texting. But that when something happens, and she studied these groups, the first thing they do is they start texting it before they think about it. And she talks about how they develop their reaction to it, not individually, but through texting. And, this is for her a kind of denial of the self and denial of a self's reflection before you react. And it's not even like in a conversation, you may be talking to someone, but you have time to listen and react. In texting, when these kids text, according to, her studies, they're all texting at the same time. There's never that moment of stopping and reflecting. And that's one of the points she's made about the danger of this kind of communal texting mentality to the psychological self, what she calls it, the development of a self. And you can't have a public realm without the self developing. So privacy is, I think, deeply important in also this idea of the public world. Kathleen writes, indivisible is bringing public happiness back to the center. You want to say anything about that, Kathleen? Happy to have you have. Is there an example that you find particularly meaningful, or is it more just a general point?
Well, that was generally was a general point. I'm actually in the UK, so I'm not really part of the indivisible kind of movement or anything like that. So I'm looking at it from afar. But what it has, I think it's done a lot to kind of open the conversation amongst people, and I think it's great as far as I'm concerned. In the UK, it's a little bit, politics and being political is much different because we still do have public goods that we can discuss and debate about. We have national health, we have education service, we have a nationalized rail system to some regards. We have nationalized pensions. We have a number of different things. So, in the conversation about public happiness, it is in the end, does that, is it really in the case of the states, is it the self-gratification? And because it's not, where we may be fighting for smaller local achievements and local goals, but it's a challenge in the states with the structure of the levels of government and the scale of the states to actually make significant change. And that's what I like about the indivisible movement itself. There was it's sort of in some ways like the Occupy movement, but it's using, there's an educational component, which is, I think, important for all forms of movement, that you have to have this kind of capacity building aspect in order for if we go back to Arendt, willing, thinking, doing, we have a society of people who have not participated in the public sphere for a very long time. So I like that aspect also of the indivisible movement, that they recognize that and they do put on localized training and localized sessions. And so that's all I want to say.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important point, that in many ways we've lost the habit of that kind of public action, and how are you re-habituated to it? And that's what we have to somehow allow that to happen, and education is part of that. Creating opportunities for it to happen is part of that. And there's no doubt that there's a lot of interest in that happening, and we'll see. Are there anyone else who want to say anything more about experiences with indivisible or recent forays into these kind of experiences of public happiness? All right, Jack writes, as often happens when I read Arendt, I can't help wondering how the ideas she articulates, which derive from small-scale societies, are to be understood in large-scale societies. I'm mindful that all my experiences of the joy of politics have been in small groups, while applications to the larger society have always been full of frustration. Okay, that is very much the topic of the next 3 chapters, because what she's going to argue, and I don't, I'm not giving it away, and we'll have plenty to talk about, is that the great innovation, one of the major innovations that Madison and the other founding fathers made was that you could create a large republic, a large commercial republic that maintained the spirit of freedom only if there were multiple smaller republics within it. And that power, which Montesquieu first said, only power can stop power, laws can't stop power. And Adams was really, of the founders, the one who most took this to heart, John Adams, understood exactly what you're saying, Jack. Part of the experience of happiness that one feels in such public action is the experience of power, of being empowered. And that feeling of power is when you act in concert with others. And you're right, it can only happen on a smaller scale. But the idea was that you could create a larger republic that nevertheless maintained power centers, multiple power centers, where people could act. In many ways, that lasted for a long time. And what has, I think, And as Gary and I were talking about before, as long as the bulk of expenditures came from smaller communities and smaller organizations, power and the public experience and public activity of power continued. The period when that really changed in the United States was during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. If you want to know where and when the United States changed from being a loosely federated, generally a federal republic, to being a centralized state, it began with Woodrow Wilson and the efforts during and after World War I to set prices and consolidate the federal bureaucracy, and then, of course, later under FDR with the New Deal. But it really started with Wilson, and prior to Wilson, the vast majority of government resources was spent at the local level in the United States, and it was during the Wilson presidency, not during FDR's presidency, during the Wilson presidency, that the federal government became a bigger part of the U.S. economy than the states or the localities combined. And since then, it has shot up. But that's the distinction. And so this is an answer to your question, Jack, because what Arendt might say, and what I'm going to suggest, is that there's nothing impossible about having a large republic be one that allows for small-scale experiences of power and public happiness. What you can't have is a centralized state and a federalized and disassociated or diversified power structure. And the real danger to public happiness is not largeness, but centralization. And the two great motors of centralization in the United States have been on the right, imperialism or the militarization of the country, and on the left, progressivism and the social welfare state. Those two ideas have, for different reasons, both potentially good or bad, depending on your politics, led to an increasing centralization of power. And that, for Arendt, is incompatible with public happiness and public freedom. And so in a large centralized state, you're absolutely right, Jack, that it is impossible. The question is, and that's why I've said numerous times that the one response is not just to go into government, but to go into local government, to try and somehow, as Gary did in his experience, bring power back, devolve power back from the federal to the local levels. But that, of course, is something that a lot of people don't want to happen because, first of all, there's a lot of people who are empowered in the federal government, and that means losing power. But I think more importantly, a lot of people believe that the federal government is a necessary paternalistic power over and against the rough and often rude and crude excesses and mistakes of local governance. As Tocqueville says in his description of town government, township freedom is crude. Township freedom always will lead to crudeness and excesses and roughnesses. And any civilized state, he says, will set itself against township freedom. Because in the name of civilization and civilizing the towns, we will take away local freedoms and impose a kind of civilizing normative limit on what they can do. And we have chosen civilization and security over freedom. That's Arendt's point.
Well, at the risk of sounding very old-fashioned, I see the that centralization of power in the state as a product of the and I think you dated it correctly, maybe a little bit earlier even, as a result of the urbanization of the country, the industrialization of production, and the aggregation of capital in fewer hands. So that is the concentration of capital rather than its dispersion. And I know it's an old-fashioned way to look at things. It's a 50s, 60s way of looking at the world, derived mostly from Marx. But I've spent a lot of time since then trying to think this through, and I always come back in that circle. I can always return to that same spot, if only.
Well, old-fashioned, if only. Arendt's view is that America was the first country to develop this idea of a government without sovereignty, in which sovereignty was so dispersed that there was no sovereign power. You can have capital accumulation without centralized government. Now, part of the problem was that capital accumulation in the late 19th century, 1880s and so, and early 20th century, became so extreme that local governments became captured by big business and monopolies. And the progressive movement found that the only way to break those monopolies was to devolve power up into the central government or the federal government. Similarly, in the 1960s, when local governments were resisting the civil rights laws, progressives found that the only way to enforce those laws was, again, to devolve power up into the federal government. Both of these are perfectly just and legitimate movements, right, that sought to control uncontrollable, unjust powers by centralizing power. And yet, the unintended consequence of this, in Arendt's reading, is the disempowerment of local communities and the centralization of power, which, as you say, Jack, in your question, which I think is exactly right, makes it very hard to have the kind of public freedom and public happiness she's talking about.
I just wanted to add one more point, which is a little off topic here, but this sense of America presenting itself or being seen as the land of milk and honey. I'm a Jewish immigrant of the 30s, and even that late, the community that I lived in actually still called this country the Golden Medina. Now, the Golden Medina is not the golden land, it's the golden state. And there was a very strong sense that what was great about America was not the opportunity to get wealthy or even comfortable, but the opportunity to live one's life with liberty, freely. And that aspect of the social organization of America was as appealing, if not more appealing, as the prospect of getting wealthy. That may have changed since then.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And I think when Arendt came here around in the 1940, I think it's 1940, right, Sam, or 41? It was, I think she had a similar experience as you did. I think she's talking about it specifically within the idea of what she calls the American dream, which I'm sure we've all heard of, right? This idea of, anyone can get rich. And that's been there from the beginning too. I think they've both been there. And I think Pat's point from earlier that this was an ambiguity is right on. I think writing in the 60s, remember, this is the early 60s. It's right after the 1950s, which is probably after the 1920s, the most materialist decade of American life, or one of them. she's seeing that idea emerge. I mean, if she'd been writing in 1988, it would have even been worse. There have been decades or periods when the American dream was all about Wall Street and money and suburban houses. And I think that's to some degree what she's responding to in 1963. Fawn writes, would you say that the idea of public happiness is related to Arendt's notion of voluntary association? People, and you're quoting from Civil Disobedience, people are bound together not through historical memories or ethnic homogeneity, but through the strength of mutual promises. I'm interested to understand better how Arendt conceptualizes voluntary association in relation to this current discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think public happiness is very much about public association for the fun of it, so voluntary. She says people didn't go and do this because it was a duty and they didn't do it out of interest. And I think there's a lot of different voluntary associations. Again, the sort of great text on this is Tocqueville, where he distinguishes one chapter on civic organizations and another on voluntary organizations. And he talks about how both are important. The civic ones, he thinks at that point, are more important, but the voluntary associations are deeply important as well. And on the question of civil disobedience, right, which you're asking about, these are voluntary associations of people to get together and break a law in order to make visible their point, which, for whatever reason, they felt unable to render visible in the public without breaking a law, or at least not visible enough. And that there's clearly for her in this idea of civil disobedience a kind of happiness, a kind of joy in doing it. And so, yes, I would put voluntary associations very much in the category of things that contribute to public happiness. I think they're not the only things, but they're part of it. Did you have a particular association in mind, Fawn? Or do you want to add to that?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to understand better is, I suppose there's a kind of I'm sorry, I'm not particularly clear in terms of my question, but I think it seems to me to imply a kind of contract, a kind of, as you say, it's a promise, or there's the notion of a kind of contractual kind of element to the association. And that's what interests me. What is the nature of these sort of tacit promises, and in what sense are they binding, and how are they? How do they become, in a sense, operable in politics and in the expression of power? That's, I suppose, really what I'm curious about.
That's great. Thank you. Well, again, we'll be reading about this in the next session when Arendt talks about the Mayflower Compact, and she makes this distinction between a contract and a compact, very much along the lines you're just talking about. And, what she's suggesting is that when the people on the Mayflower got together and drew up the Mayflower Compact, no one authorized them to do so. It wasn't like they were allowed to do so, and there was no one in charge who could say, you have to sign this. They did it. And they did it out of the word you're using, she uses as well here as well, mutual promising. This is her model for it. And they just thought they had the right to do it. Where's that right come from? They gave it to themselves. It's no one gives it to them. And that's what she's referring to. And so it's one of those just great things that happens. Tocqueville, again, so much of where she gets this from, I think, is Tocqueville, so it's good to go back to it. But in chapter 5 of book 2 of part 1 of Democracy in America, where he's talking about the town governments, says that this human need to speak and govern oneself is natural. It's just something that in all places and all times happens until it's stamped out by the centralizing and civilizing impulses. That's a kind of naturalism that I'm not sure Arendt would buy or not. But she certainly thinks that in local governments and in local places, people get together and compact in the sense of promise each other that they'll do things and they do it. Another example of this that she writes about in a number of places are what she calls workers' councils. So she's very interested in how, on shop floors, workers getting together for unionizing or organizing, start talking and organizing and getting together. And then they decide they're going to work together for some goal. And these workers' councils are for her incredible examples of this kind of compacting based on mutual promising with no authorization whatsoever. And that's very much what she means by public happiness and voluntary association. So it's these kind of activities. And out of these workers' councils, she says, okay, one or two workers will sort of begin to take a leadership role, and they'll be acknowledged as a leader, and they will become the leader of that council. But then they'll go up to a higher council, and there'll be a bunch of these leaders, representatives, and they'll work together, and some people will rise up out of them. And this is what she calls a non-hereditary, non-economic elite, or we could call it a political elite. And so, she's sometimes called an elitist. And she says, well, I'm not an elitist in the old sense of hereditary elite or noble elite or an economic elite, but I do think there are those who, more than others, enjoy public happiness and are willing to trade luxury for public happiness. And that becomes the elite in a democracy for her. And she's willing to, and so she says, yeah, at that point, I think, an elite can emerge, but they're the elite that emerge up because of their love for public happiness. And she's okay with that kind of elite. She'll discuss this, and we'll talk a little bit more. It's in the final pages of the book. This is the last 10 pages of the book are on the public, the political elite, as opposed to other kinds of elite. And so when we get to the last chapter of the book, we'll come back to this question. Is that all right, Fawn? Good. Sam writes, a trace of the spirit of revolution and joy of public participation still exists in American politics. But in Arendt's account, we failed to find proper institutional homes for the spirit of revolution. That is why it is the lost treasure. I'm not sure Occupy, from my experience, is the kind of joy she was discussing. Occupy became just another example of how the individual continues to triumph over the citizen. As I think you know, or many of you know, I largely agree with Sam on this. I was taken with and impressed with the joy that students found in Occupy, right? They did find joy in it. And for many of them, it was the first time they had experienced joy in public. And they were in a public park, or they were in a public place in different cities, and it was revelatory for them. And so I don't discount that. I'm not saying this is what Sam is saying, but I don't want to be sort of the old fogey looking down and saying that's not it. I took it seriously. They were finding joy, and I don't want to discount that. I happen to agree with Sam that there's an Arendtian critique of Occupy, which is that, well, there's a number of Arendtian critiques of Occupy. One is that it imagined itself simply as a protest and not as trying to engage in something, and thus saw itself only negatively and not as trying to create a community, a larger community. And then as a result, it became, I think this is what Sam means by individual over citizen. It became, in a certain way, solipsistic. People were talking only to people who agreed with them, and not to citizens, not to a part of a larger pluralistic political world. And it sort of cut itself off from the kinds of meaningful political experience of argument with people who actually might disagree with each other. Is that what you mean by individual over citizen, Sam? And I'm assuming
sort of what I mean.
You got to turn your sound up or something.
Can you hear me now?
Very lightly. I don't know why.
I'm not sure what the.
Oh, that's better.
Okay, I'll just lean in. So I was one of the first founders of Occupy in DC, and I watched it grow from about 6 of us standing in the middle of a park to hundreds in the tent city, and I eventually exited because I couldn't bear to participate. There was no joy after a while, and in part because what was happening politically is that the individuals who were organizing within the movement ended up replicating, I'm going to use the word neoliberal, although I realize I don't like the word and it's a fraught word, neoliberal models of governance. So what I mean is when we would have our general meetings, which would have, usually around 100 or so people, at one meeting, the action committee voted for sovereignty to make decisions about actions without approval from the General Assembly. And then the finance committee wanted sovereignty to operate separately from the General Assembly as well. And what happened is that they were not only cut off, I mean it in 2 senses. The first is in this sense, they were not only cut off from an engagement with a larger public, but they were cut off from themselves within the movement, and they became these self-interested pockets, and all sorts of horrible things happened inside the movement as a result of that, including sexual assault, people stealing tens of thousands of dollars, violence, and anything else you would expect in such a situation. The other is that I think, Arendt has this wonderful, when she's reading the Federalist Papers and she's talking about Madison and Jefferson, she has this incredible sense of the institutions of American politics, which are instruments that give form to public and political life. And we get to participate and shape those instruments as citizens. We get to work within government and with government and give form to that. And I think today we have very little sense of that. And the Occupy movement was not a democratic movement in that sense. It had no commitment to American political institutions. It wanted to fight against the privatization of politics, it started with a very simple platform to get money out of politics. And it mushroomed. But they were against American politics. There's no democratic spirit there, I think, in the sense that Arendt is talking about it. So okay. That's the other part.
Yeah, no, I think the refusal to make demands and the refusal to engage in politics was certainly, I think, part of what I was trying to say and agreeing with you, individualism as opposed to citizenship.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into a big argument about Occupy, so we're gonna move on before that happens. Susan writes, it's curious that Hannah Arendt, in discussing the triumph of luxury and consuming and greed over political engagement, doesn't focus on capitalism. And of course, today, the role of money in politics makes it less likely that most people will have fun in politics or feel that we can be heard and make a difference. And the political scene today is so distasteful, and so many of the people involved in electoral politics are so corrupt, dishonest, untrustworthy, etc., that politics does not seem like much fun. Right. Yes. Susan, nicely said. So there's two parts to that, right? One is money in politics, which is an ancient problem, long before capitalism. And the other is capitalism. And so there's no doubt that you're absolutely right that the enormous sums of money that have come in to dominate politics has made it less fun, and made it dishonest, untrustworthy, corrupt, etc. That said, over and over again, people prove that you can win with less money, and there can be ways of acting with less money, although there has to be a way to stop this money from being there. But I would just decouple that from capitalism. Arendt is worried about freedom. We always have to come back to that. That's her fundamental idea, and freedom in the sense of public freedom. And from her point of view, both capitalism and communism are threats to freedom in different ways. Capitalism is a threat to freedom in the way you just said, in the sense that it can create huge sums of money that corrupt and buy off the political system. And communism or socialism is a threat to freedom insofar as it creates bureaucracies that insulate government from popular control in ways that disempower people and render them unfree. She thinks that both capitalism and socialism can lead to the loss of freedom. The one advantage that she sees in capitalism, right, is that it protects private property, and thus privacy, and thus a space in which one can at least be free and prepare oneself to enter the public realm. That is, to her, the one, in a sense, saving grace of capitalism. There's no doubt that she thinks capitalism needs to be highly regulated, and that the amount of money that can come into politics, I think she would. I mean, obviously I don't know her position on campaign finance reform, but I feel fairly safe in saying that she would be aghast at the claim that you cannot, that the public democratic citizenship of this country cannot limit the amount of money in politics because it's unconstitutional to do so, because it violates free speech, right? I mean, from 1776 until 1940, it was perfectly legal in this country for people to prevent money from coming into politics. That all changed with the rise of free speech jurisprudence in this country. And one of the great benefits that I think Zephyr Teachout has done in her research onto campaign finance reform is to make it clear how there were two separate justifications for democracy in the United States. For most of our history, the core argument for democracy is that the political system had to be protected from corruption. And so she goes back to the debates in the Constitutional Convention and argues that what people were most worried about was the corrupting influence of money, and therefore corruption. The Emoluments Clause and others were designed to prevent political corruption. In the 1940s and 50s, a new argument emerged that democracy was based on consent, and as consensual, it was based on freedom of speech and everybody the ability to hear all arguments, and money was speech, and therefore you couldn't limit money. And it was only in the late 20th century that this new version of democratic, of the foundations of democracy, replaced the old corruption arguments. I'm not sure if we can go back to it or not. Maybe that ship has sailed. But I don't think it's a capitalist argument per se. I think it's an argument of what is the foundation of democracy. One side says democracy is simply everyone can say what they want, and you need money to say what you want in the public sphere, so money is free speech. And the other side says, no, the community of democracy that makes decisions has to be protected from corruption. And that strikes me as a meaningful difference. Susan, do you want to respond to that? I don't know if that helps as an answer. Kathleen says that Lawrence Lessig is a good reference, and he is. Lawrence Lessig and Zephyr both spoke at our conference a couple of years ago on the new America, the idea of America. They're people who I think are absolutely right in their emphasis that we need to somehow figure out how to take the issue of corruption back from the free speech lobby. And while most of you know that I'm someone who believes very strongly in free speech and the First Amendment, I think the great mistaken decision was not Citizens United per se, but Buckley v. Vallejo, in which speech was associated with money, and thus it became unconstitutional to limit campaign contributions. I think that was one of the worst decisions ever made by the Supreme Court. So go from there. Gary maybe continues this. Susan's comments on the corruption of government at every level is on target, and one reason that good people who would bring joy to the job flee the idea of entering politics. But the only antidote is involvement. My saying is, if you want to have self-government, you have to get involved yourself. Yeah, I think that's right. And door-to-door doesn't require a lot of money. Susan writes, Roger, you mentioned Critchley's and others' critique of Hannah Arendt. Could you please provide specific references? I've been wanting to read some smart critique and debates. What do you recommend? Well, Jacques Rancière, in his book Dissensus, has a chapter on Hannah Arendt and human rights, in which he criticizes, he on the one hand builds his argument on her, but then criticizes her for saying that since, and this is not, I think, exactly right, but he says that since you can only have rights as a citizen, Hannah Arendt participates in the exclusion of non-citizens from rights. I think that's a misreading of Hannah Arendt, a pretty violent misreading of Hannah Arendt, but it's probably one of the most widespread, or in the political theory world at least, it's a fairly widespread one. So you can read Jacques Rancière in Dissensus. Critchley doesn't build his argument against Arendt, as far as I know, but he builds his argument against for a kind of freedom in politics in a number of places, but primarily in his book Infinitely Demanding, which is the book I teach when I am teaching this material. And David Graeber develops this argument in his long anthropological account of anarchist movements called Direct Action. It's like a 400 or 500 page book. It's actually it's very interesting. And for those of you interested in kind of protest movements and direct action, you'd probably find it very interesting. Graeber, I'm not sure if he's read
Can I
Arendt.
add one more, Roger?
Yeah.
Relevant to our discussion, the first chapter of Jason Frank's book, Constituent Moments, offers a great reading related to this conversation of Arendt's on revolution.
Yeah, that's great. And Jason is someone who very much identifies with Arendt, but has a critical take on her as well. And again, somewhat in line with the Rancière critique in some sense of suggesting that Arendt, in seeking to found political orders, participates in the exclusion of those who are outside them. Again, I think this is a misreading of Arendt. She does want to found political orders, but they are never supposed to be purely stable. And if anything, there's a response that she provides the argument for how people can force themselves to appear in a political order from which they're excluded. And actually, there's a book by a younger scholar whose name I cannot exactly pronounce. Her name is Aichan Gwandoktu, and she teaches at Barnard in the city. And she has a book that I'm not going to, maybe someone can look it up and tell me while we're talking or write it down. I think it's like Rightlessness and Human Rights and Rightlessness, or something like that. And Aichan does a very nice job of, in a sense, saying the Rancière critique is important but wrong, and in fact, Arendt provides the resources for refugees and excluded groups and stateless people to think about their problems as one of appearing in public and thus force them way into the public. And she does some excellent readings of a number of refugee movements that do such a thing. And I think is in a sense a response to the Rancière critique of Arendt in a very smart way. Paul writes, I don't think it's realistic to think that public involvement in government is going to increase. If by public involvement we mean traditional things like speaking at public hearings, attending council meetings, and the like. That's just not something most people have the time or interest to do in 2017. In addition, the powers that be do everything possible to make this unpleasant and convenient. Is there a way to utilize technology, especially the internet, to encourage and facilitate public involvement? Or would this necessarily amount to a form of direct democracy that would eliminate serious deliberation and devolve into mob rule? Okay, I mean, there's a lot in here, Paul, and I think it's an excellent question. You say the first part is you don't think it's realistic to think people are going to get involved. Well, I think that I understand that, and yet I'm not sure how right it is. I think there's an enormous groundswell of desire to get back involved. And what I would say is this. I think people would get back involved if they thought there was something at stake. And this comes back to, again, something Gary and I were talking about earlier. There is a desire in this country still for people to believe that we have local government, that local government matters, etc. And yet, over and over again, largely because of the taxation issue, local governments have disempowered themselves. They don't. It's hard to tell, your 50 neighbors that we're going to raise your taxes. It's easier to tell the whole state of New York we're going to raise your taxes. And so over and again, we lower taxes locally, which makes local government dependent upon state, county, and federal government, which means that power is centralized up, and therefore, who's going to go waste their time at a town meeting when there's not much at stake? If the towns actually had money to spend and there was actually something at stake, I actually believe people would go to these meetings. Maybe I'm wrong. And there's different ways to do that. One is to reassert a local tax base, but another is to have the higher government, the federal government, the state governments, simply proportionally give money to local governments and have the local governments decide how to spend them. At that point, you're evening out the tax burden nationally, but you're devolving power in how it's spent locally. And that potentially allows you to make what goes on in local government matter in a way that would bring people back into it. I know that at different times in my life, I've tried to get involved in local government. I've gone to meetings, I've gotten involved. And what I realized is I can spend hours and hours on this. And in the end, I have no power to do anything because the government has no money to spend or no authority to change things. And I give up because I'm not an idiot. Who's going to spend all their time doing this and you don't get anything out of it? But I think if there's actually something at stake, there's more of a chance of people getting involved. The second part of it is technology. This is like, there's more people writing about this in Arendt than anything else right now, right? Is the internet a new public space? Can you create a kind of public community on the internet? My basic inclination is to say no, but I'm open to the possibility. I have no idea. There are political parties, mostly in Europe. Some of you may have heard of them, called the Pirate Party. It started in Sweden. Rick Falkvinge was the man who founded the first one in Sweden, and he actually spoke at one of the Arendt Center conferences a number of years ago. And one of their main planks is to use the internet and technology to create debate and public sphere about issues, so that the people who run for government on the Pirate Party, in a sense, commit themselves to voting in the ways that the Pirate Party communities choose on the internet. I think if you were interested in this question, Paul, the Pirate Party might be a place to look and start. And so someone found it, Carly, and thank you, Rightlessness in an Age of Rights by Etienne Gondogdu. It's an interesting book, and that would be a way to, in a sense, I think Susan asked the question, if you read Rancière and Jason Frank, and then you want to see a response from an Arendtian, you can read Etienne. I've written a little bit about it, responding to them as well, and I'm writing more about it, so I'll let you know. In any case, we're not going to meet for a little while, because we're not going to meet this week because of the next week because of the conference, and nor the week after, because I'm not going to have time to record anything this week because of the conference. So we're going to take 2 weeks off, and we'll meet in 3 weeks, and then we're going to move towards the end of this book, which is really extraordinary. And I very much look forward to discussing it with you. So thank you all very much. And I hope to see some of you at the conference, and keep enjoying reading Hannah Arendt. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Roger.